was a nightmare.
Story 1. The house on the Laredo Road. I've spent nearly 35 years working as a home renovations contractor here in Texas. During that time, I've restored beautiful homes and built lasting relationships with wonderful clients. But some jobs leave marks that never fade, and this is one of them. In March 1994, a man contacted me about a property he'd recently purchased, a dilapidated house roughly 6 miles outside Laredo. The scope of work was extensive: foundation stabilization, structural framing repairs, beam replacements to meet code requirements, complete roof re-shingling, door and window resealing, and a full utilities overhaul including HVAC replacement. Inside, we need to insulate the walls and attic, refinish wooden floors, repair bathroom fixtures, and secure all necessary permits from the county courthouse. This was a 3 to 6 month project with an estimated cost between $50,000 and $100,000, possibly more. I accepted the contract after a thorough review and signed the paperwork on Friday afternoon. The owner handed me the keys, and I planned to start first thing Monday morning. When I arrived at the property that Monday, excitement quickly turned to frustration. My key didn't work. I called the owner, but it was early and he didn't answer. So I left a polite voicemail explaining the situation and requesting the correct key as soon as possible. Rather than waste the trip, I spent the next half hour surveying the building's exterior and assessing the work ahead. Then a black SUV pulled up fast, and a man in a security uniform stepped out. He asked if I had permission to be there. After I explained who I was and showed my contractor credentials, he softened slightly, but informed me I couldn't proceed yet. Safety inspectors hadn't completed their evaluation. This confused me, as I thought I was conducting the safety evaluation, but he retrieved official-looking paperwork bearing the owner's name. Everything appeared legitimate, so I drove back into town. By lunchtime, the owner returned my call. What I expected to be a simple key mix-up turned into something far stranger. He sounded irritated when he insisted he'd given me the correct key. I calmly explained otherwise and mentioned we had a week before the safety inspection anyway. "What safety inspection?" he asked immediately. I described my encounter with the security guard. "What security guard?" That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. Based on my experience, illegal activity was likely occurring in his vacant property. The owner sighed heavily and asked if I could meet him at the house the following morning with a locksmith and a sheriff's deputy. The next morning, I arrived at 8. Over the next 20 minutes, the client, locksmith, and deputy arrived separately. After the client briefed everyone on the situation, the locksmith opened the door and the deputy let us inside. The first thing that struck me was how clean certain areas were. The house remained dilapidated, with dusty furniture and junk in some rooms, but the hallway appeared meticulously swept, as did one of the 4 ground floor rooms. When the deputy entered that clean room, he immediately radioed for backup. A metal chair had been bolted to the floor. Chains lay piled in one corner. It was clear something terrible had occurred here, something involving restraint and captivity. But we didn't understand the full extent until we reached the upstairs bathroom. The bathroom had both a tub and a separate shower stall. Like the hallway and room downstairs, someone had cleaned this space carefully. But what stopped me cold was the shower cubicle. Someone had reinforced it with concrete slabs. These slabs bore what looked like bullet impact marks, not penetrating all the way through, but clearly showing where projectiles had struck. The deputy immediately ordered us outside. This was now a crime scene. We stood in silence outside, feeling a chill despite the Texas heat. We just walked through a place where people had been tortured and likely killed. The number of victims remained unknown. The cleanliness of certain areas made horrifying sense now. They'd scrubbed down the active spaces, probably in the 24 hours after my first visit. The realization hit hard. When I tried that key the first time, the perpetrators were likely inside, possibly with victims. They'd been mere feet away, hidden behind that locked door, while I stood outside completely unaware. A profound sense of they were just here settled over us. I'll never forget the deputy's expression. A young officer who'd expected to find squatters, but instead discovered a torture chamber. Renovations were delayed while investigators combed through the property. They found no evidence inside the house. They dug up the surrounding property so extensively it resembled the moon's surface, craters everywhere. Still nothing. The police kept their findings largely confidential, but when work finally resumed, the client shared what they told him. Based on the selective cleanliness in an otherwise neglected property, the house had almost certainly been occupied during my first visit. While I tried unlocking the door, torturers and murderers were inside, possibly with their victims. That second wave of realization was worse than the first. I've been standing right there, separated by a single door from unspeakable evil, completely oblivious to the horror occurring just beyond my reach. Story 2. The tape recorder. I served as a Texas Ranger for nearly 2 decades. During that time, I witnessed things that haunt a person to their grave. But one case haunts me more than most. It surfaces on those cold, lonely nights when I wonder if I truly made a difference. In the early 80s, as a younger man working under a veteran ranger, we received an assignment to question Paul Wolf about his wife's ex-husband. Billy Staton and his current partner had been missing for several days. They'd last been seen visiting Wolf's residence. Wolf was married to Staton's ex-wife and shared custody of Staton's daughter, Melody. Wolf believed Staton was a poor father, likely influenced by his wife's negative comments, and frequently became aggressive during custody exchanges. Staton, anticipating this hostility, had started bringing a small tape recorder in his pocket to document Wolf's behavior for the court. When we arrived at Wolf's home, he denied any knowledge of Staton's visit, claiming Staton and his fiancée, Leticia Castro, hadn't stopped by in nearly a week. Since they hadn't appeared for custody exchange, Wolf said they'd kept Melody until the parents decided to show up. We knew this was false. That lie gave us grounds to arrest him on suspicion of murder. Once in custody, Wolf's story changed dramatically. He now admitted Staton and Castro had visited, but claimed Staton became forceful and aggressive when trying to remove his daughter. Wolf said he'd intervened to calm Staton, but Staton began yelling and shoving him. A fight erupted, and Wolf claimed Staton tried to murder him. He said he'd yelled for his wife to call police, but Staton overpowered him, forcing him to escalate. To save himself, his wife, and her daughter, Wolf claimed he'd struck Staton repeatedly with an iron bar. Wolf said he'd blacked out in a rage, and when he came to, both Staton and Castro were dead. In a panic, he'd loaded the bodies into his truck and dumped them in a nearby river. He told us the location, so we went to verify. The bodies were exactly where he described, bloated and partially decomposed from days in lukewarm water. Wolf was counting on advanced decomposition to hide the truth, but the medical examiner found that Castro had been shot in the head at close range with a large caliber weapon. This directly contradicted Wolf's claim that he'd only used the iron bar in self-defense. But the real breakthrough came from Billy Staton's body. Hidden on his person, we found a small tape recorder, still containing its tape. Restoring water-damaged audio was beyond our capabilities, so we sent the tape to the FBI lab in Washington. The tape had developed mold, but lab technicians advised us that drying it would cause irreparable damage. We mailed it to them in a small jar of water. Several weeks later, they returned a fully working copy. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but we could distinguish individual voices and understand their words. And what they said completely contradicted Paul Wolf's entire story. Right from the beginning, Wolf's account was exposed as a bold-faced lie. On the recording, we hear Staton asking his daughter to come with him, at which point she begins crying. This initially seemed to support Wolf's claim about Staton being a poor father whose daughter dreaded spending time with him. But as she cried, Staton wasn't angry or aggressive. He attempted to calm and console what sounded like a tired, cranky child. Yet as Staton tried to soothe his daughter, Wolf became aggressive. After a brief struggle, we hear a series of deep, heavy thumps, the sound of blunt force trauma. Next, we hear Mrs. Wolf, Staton's ex-wife, yelling, "Get him! Hurry up and get him!" Then, hit him again. Then the front door opens and closes. This was Castro attempting to escape. Someone ran to block the door, and moments later, We hear the gunshot that ended her life. Mrs. Wolf then yells, "Get him up. Get him out of here." At this point, Wolf enlisted Glenn Henderson, who later confessed to helping dispose of the bodies and received a life sentence. Later in the recording, apparently during cleanup, we hear Wolf say, "Ah, damn it, Glenn. Look at the mess you made." We discovered that Henderson had failed to properly wrap one body, and while carrying it out, a significant amount of blood leaked onto the hallway carpet. This became crucial evidence, even after the Wolves hired an industrial-grade cleaning service to try removing it. We put both Paul and Mrs. Wolf away for a very long time. During my years as a ranger, I witnessed many disturbing crime scenes, but we always arrived after everything was over, after the violence had ended and the scene had gone cold. We occasionally reviewed security camera footage, though back then it was black and white, grainy, and silent like watching a silent film. I'd seen many dead people. I'd seen people receive fatal injuries. I just had never heard anyone die before. The sound Billy Staton made on that recording, the groan that escaped him as his skull was being crushed, I think that might haunt me for the rest of my natural life. Story 3. The Mexican job. I was raised in a West Texas trailer park by a single mother. The rest can be summed up by a couple of lines from a Merle Haggard song. "Dear old daddy, rest his soul, left my mom a heavy load. She tried so very hard to fill his shoes, working hours without rest, wanted me to have the best. She tried to raise me right, but I refused. People said my daddy was wild, and I guess I sprang from that same seed. But while my buddies chose poisons like drugs, alcohol, or women, I got hooked on something different: adrenaline. I've been addicted since I stood up to my middle school bully. He beat me badly, but I landed one perfect right hook on his face before he did. Afterward, I felt so good I could have strutted while sitting down. He never bothered me again, and though I didn't last long in high school, when I heard my younger cousin was being harassed, I jumped at the chance to intervene. My freshman cousin owned a toy cap gun shaped like a pearl-handled revolver, his pride and joy. His own fault for bringing it to high school, I suppose, because it got snatched immediately. He kept quiet about it for weeks, so by the time I found out, the cap gun was long gone. But when I confronted the bully, I made him empty his pockets. I took his sneakers. I took the shirt off his back. That rush was even bigger than punching my own bully. That's when I decided my career path. The way other kids see a Marine in dress blues or a roughneck working his rig and think, that's what I want to be. I robbed that kid and thought I could get used to this. I started at 16, stealing cars and burglarizing houses to avoid getting a real job. By the time I started frequenting bars and meeting the right people, I got involved in more organized crime. I began robbing trucks with a guy who called himself TJ. We'd wait until truckers picked up lot lizards, then raid their cargo while the cab was occupied. They made decent money for a while, but as bills mounted, we needed something more lucrative. We graduated to robbing gas stations, bars, and pawn shops, anything that might net us 4 or 5 figures on deposit day. As we targeted bigger establishments, we brought on a guy named Jody for crowd control. This was my crew for about 3 years. We'd hit a place maybe once every few months when conditions were perfect. But when we planned a job on a small credit union, Jody wasn't available. After searching for a replacement, TJ said he'd found someone named Vincent. Before working with Vincent, I wanted to meet face to face. We arranged dinner at a small place outside Odessa. TJ said Vincent was a big guy, sharp too, making him the perfect temporary replacement for Jody. When Vincent walked through the door, I couldn't have agreed more. The guy was terrifying, not just because he stood nearly 7 feet tall in his boots, but because of how he carried himself like he was meaner than a skillet full of rattlesnakes. I'm not easily frightened, but sitting across from Vincent with his long, wild-looking beard had me feeling trapped. He had this way of looking at you that felt like he was peering into your head, quietly figuring you out. Vincent claimed military experience, though not with the U.S. military, and said he had connections to the Aryan nations after serving time in New Mexico. He was comfortable working in a crew and willing to do things our way if we organized properly. The only red flag was when he said he couldn't discuss his foreign military service. That triggered my nonsense detector. But if we just needed him to stand there and look intimidating, he'd do fine. We hit the credit union about a week later. Unlike tellers at big bank chains who just collect paychecks, small-town credit union managers pour their lives into their work. They know their customers, their neighbors, and they care about them. They don't like outsiders thinking they can take something for nothing. Small-town credit union managers might think twice, maybe 3 times before surrendering keys or codes. In my profession, seconds meant safety. The longer that crucial phase lasted, the greater the danger of getting caught. The manager at this job was no different. From the look in his eyes, I knew immediately he wouldn't cooperate. I ended up pistol whipping him several times to demonstrate I was serious. I'm not proud of it, but seconds equals safety. He took one hit, then another, still didn't break. I worried he might never break. Then Vincent pointed at one of 2 tellers and asked if she was the manager's daughter. The manager was lily-white Texan, while the teller appeared Mexican or possibly Central American. When Vincent first suggested they were related, I thought, "What are you smoking?" But when I looked back at the manager, pure terror filled his eyes. Vincent smiled, vaulted over the counter, and began tearing at the girl's blouse buttons, describing in obscene detail what he planned to do to her in front of her father. The manager nearly lost his mind, promising to surrender the keys if Vincent left her alone. That's all it took. We were out minutes later with a substantial haul. Later, I asked Vincent if he was serious, if he truly would have done those things he'd threatened to make the manager comply. He just smiled that big wolfish smile and said, "Whatever it takes to get the job done, brother. Whatever it takes." I had no doubt he meant it. I never met anyone so obviously psychopathic. But I hadn't seen anything yet. Our next job with Vincent targeted a savings bank outside San Antonio. One of the Mexican supervisors we needed to open safety deposit boxes had some kind of breakdown and forgot all her English. Maybe deliberately to slow us down, or maybe genuinely. Who knows? But suddenly Vincent stepped forward and began speaking fluent Spanish to her. Not just speaking Spanish, talking to her like a reassuring uncle, trying to soothe and calm her. It worked. She froze, stopped shrieking, and just listened as he gave his speech. When he finished, she handed over the keys to the boxes. Once again, we made our getaway in minutes. We all wanted to know what he'd said, but Vincent calmly explained he'd simply told her what would happen if she didn't hand over those keys. That San Antonio bank job was the last we saw Vincent for a while. He said he had business out of state, but was working on something and would let us know if he could use our help. We said we appreciated him keeping us in mind, but honestly, we were happy to part ways. Vincent got the job done, but he felt like a liability, like it was only a matter of time before he did something terrible, like what he'd threatened to do to that manager's daughter. About 9 months later, TJ got a call from Vincent about the job he'd been casing. I was at TJ's place when the call came. The second he said, "Oh, hey, Vincent, how's your mom and them?" I rolled my eyes thinking, here we go again. At one point in the conversation, TJ started sounding skeptical, saying things like, "I don't know, Vincent." Sounds like a lot. But then Vincent said something I didn't hear, that made TJ look like Jesus Christ himself had spoken through that phone. His eyes went wide, his jaw dropped, and he stayed quiet for a long time before arranging a meeting. Driving to the diner with TJ, I tried figuring out what was happening. He kept saying things like, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," or "You're better off hearing it from the horse's mouth." He also said if he told me what Vincent had in mind, I'd probably jump out of the moving car. That's when I asked him to at least tell me what kind of job they discussed. TJ kept his eyes on the road but said, "The last one before we retire." After that, I stayed quiet and stewed in the mystery until we reached the diner. Vincent was leaning over a huge plate of steak and eggs, eating like he hadn't in weeks. We asked where he'd been. "Mexico," he said, then explained he'd been eyeing the score of a lifetime, tracking cash couriers south of the border for weeks, casing their routes, learning their schedules, and assembling enough firepower to make the job doable. I asked what kind of firepower we needed just to scare a couple of couriers. He said to stop them, we needed something that would pierce armor. The golden rule of armed robbery is don't kill anyone. Then you're a murderer and police will hunt you like one. We don't use armor-piercing anything because the best jobs are those where bullets don't get fired. When Vincent mentioned armor-piercing rounds, I was halfway out the door. But then he explained that to get the couriers to stop, we needed to at least demonstrate we could pierce their truck's armor. Without that, they'd just roll through the ambush and escape. I'd assumed this was a standard armored car job. When Vincent revealed the couriers were carrying cash illegally across the border for the Sinaloa cartel, I thought he'd lost his mind. Just about everyone in America knows who the cartels are these days, but the Sinaloa stand tall even among their fellow narcos. They're one of Mexico's oldest cartels and, at that time, by far the most powerful. Led by El Chapo for a while, they don't mess around when it comes to protecting their operations. When Vincent suggested robbing them, I figured it'd be quicker to just shoot ourselves in the face right there. Robbing the cartel meant ending up dead as buzzard bait. But Vincent said he had a plan. At the time, the Sinaloa cartel was at war with the Juarez cartel. Couriers were getting robbed, hitmen dying by the dozen. It was chaotic down there. That meant, according to Vincent, the Sinaloa wouldn't suspect 4 gringos were responsible, at least not unless directed by their Juarez enemies. To him, it was foolproof. If we did it right, we could bring home enough laundered cash to retire on. We wouldn't have to worry about washing it or anyone coming after us. We just need to figure out what kind of porch swing we wanted and which beer we'd drink while sitting on it until we were old enough to die. I didn't realize how badly I wanted out until I saw that opportunity. I guess it was the same for TJ and Jody. After thinking for about 30 seconds, we decided to go for it. About a week later, we met Vincent just before midnight for the long drive to the ambush site. Vincent's plan was relatively simple. At dawn, when the couriers approached in their 2 trucks, we'd pull a heavy chain across the dirt road, disable their engines with armor-piercing bullets, and keep shooting until guards were dead and driver surrendered. When I asked how he was sure drivers would surrender, Vincent said they were just drivers. They'd give up once they realized they were in trouble. I started having doubts. If those drivers lost all that cash, the cartel wouldn't just say, "Better luck next time." They'd torture them first to ensure they weren't involved in the theft. Even if they weren't, they'd carve them up and hang them from a bridge as an example. The more I thought about it, the worse the feeling in my stomach got. But even when that feeling intensified until I wanted to vomit, I'd push it down and tell myself, get this right and you're home free. No more jobs, no more Vincent, no more worrying about anything. That's what kept my mouth shut during the border crossing. It was still dark when we set up, tying the chain to a tree and covering it with a thin layer of dirt. We dug small holes on a low rise near the road, with one position closer so whoever occupied it could pull up the chain to block the couriers. After that, it was just waiting, watching, hoping the couriers didn't change their schedule last minute. We waited hours, watching the sun climb higher, feeling the air warm. Vincent said the trucks would pass about an hour after dawn, but 2 hours passed with no trucks in sight, and I started doubting they'd show at all. By around 8 in the morning, we were all sweating heavily, barely able to hear our own thoughts above the cicadas. Then, after maybe another hour of sweat and frustration, I saw a glint of light on the horizon, 2 white trucks coming into view. We started whooping and hollering a little after sitting in those dusty holes so long, but Vincent told us to shut up and be ready. As we watched the trucks approach, TJ grabbed the chain, waiting for Vincent's signal to yank it into the roadway. When the signal came and TJ forced the trucks to brake hard as the chain rose up, Vincent didn't aim for the engine blocks. He aimed straight for the truck's tinted windows and unleashed hell. Someone in the second truck managed a few shots, but Jody was ready with his AK. It was pure chaos, but over in seconds. So quick that TJ and I didn't even get time to fire. Once the smoke cleared and everything went quiet except for the groans of dying couriers, we made our move. As we ran toward the trucks, I remember TJ yelling about Vincent not having to shoot everyone. Vincent said, "What's done is done," and told him to shut his mouth and get to work. TJ had just unlocked the second truck storage, and we were about to start rummaging in the back when we suddenly heard a child crying. In that way, only a child's cry can grab your attention. TJ and I spun around to see where the sound came from. I remember seeing Jody wide-eyed, looking into the front truck, then seeing Vincent open one of the back doors and start speaking Spanish. TJ had a daughter who stayed with his mom. so realizing there'd been kids in that lead truck sent him off the handle. He marched over to where Vincent was speaking Spanish to them and demanded to know what he was doing. Vincent said he was telling them to stay in the trucks because someone would come by to get them before long. TJ didn't like that one bit. We all knew what happens to kids or dogs locked in hot cars. He and Vincent argued for about a minute about the children's safety. Vincent thought for a moment, then said we could drop them at a gas station once we got back on American soil. TJ didn't like that idea either, but just like the surrendering drivers thing, I don't think Vincent was ever really planning on following through. Because as Jody and I were hauling a big bag of cash back toward where we'd hidden our truck, we heard 2 gunshots, then the sound of TJ screaming. We dropped the cash bag and ran back, expecting TJ might have been shot, possibly by a courier who wasn't as dead as we'd thought. But when we reached the top of that rise and saw why TJ was still screaming at Vincent, calling him every curse word imaginable, Vincent had taken those 2 Mexican children out of the truck and shot them both in the head. Vincent was probably a head and shoulders taller than TJ and nearly twice as heavy. But after what he'd done, shooting those 2 kids, TJ went at him like a wild animal. Vincent had to point his pistol just to make him back off. But TJ was hysterical, yelling, "Why? Why? What did they do to you? Huh? What did they do?" Vincent started saying the cartel could be on our trail if they talked. But this was after telling us about the cartel war and how they'd never know it was us. I still don't know if that was nonsense from the start or if he changed his plan last minute. Those kids didn't have to die. Only one person had to die on that dirt road in Mexico, and it sure as hell wasn't those children. When Vincent finished his speech about too much money being at stake to take chances, he turned his back on TJ to grab one of the bags. TJ pulled his pistol and shot Vincent 4 or 5 times in the back. Vincent hit the dirt, gasping for air. TJ walked over and put him down with 1 shot to the head. Jody and I didn't freak out. Not like we did seeing those kids lying there with dirt soaking up their blood. What TJ did felt natural almost. No one questioned him. We just grabbed all the cash we could carry, loaded it into the truck, and took off toward the border. We didn't celebrate the money. We couldn't. Even when we reached someplace safe and realized our shares tallied up to just under $1 million each, we were too exhausted to do anything but sit quietly with a few beers, wondering how it all went so wrong. Those kids weren't 12 or 13. They were small, too small to even talk, I think. They wouldn't have been able to tell 4 gringos apart from the guys in ZZ Top. So why did Vincent kill them? I remember asking that question out loud, but TJ had had enough. After stomping out a cigarette, he told me it didn't matter because that son of a bitch was dead. Then he went to pack his share of the money. Once we were all packed and agreed to lay low for a while, Jody went to stay with his parents in Oklahoma while TJ took an extended vacation in New Orleans. I went to stay with a girl I'd been seeing, a very low-key retirement party. I didn't tell her about Vincent or the kids. I just said I was done. She'd always wanted me to walk the line and get a real job, so the news was music to her ears. She told me to stay as long as I needed. About 3 weeks later, TJ showed up driving a new Dodge. Well, new to him, we couldn't exactly drive around in the same truck we'd used for the robbery, so it was a practical purchase. We went for a drive, caught up on things, and TJ asked if I wanted to grab a burger later. I said sure, and we arranged for me to stop by his place around 7. It felt like we were starting fresh. We wouldn't have to look over our shoulders anymore. Work wasn't a topic we'd ever really need to discuss again, and we had more money than we could spend without being foolish. We could stop surviving and start living. I found myself grinning over nothing but the prospect of a burger with an old friend. He dropped me back at my place. After a few hours of relaxing with my girl, I drove to TJ's and knocked on the door. The Dodge was parked in the driveway, but no one answered. It was almost exactly 7, and he wasn't the type to flake on plans. Assuming he was probably running late or in the shower, I walked around to the yard and tried the back door. TJ never locked his back door. He always left it open in case we needed a place to crash. He also wasn't keeping his share of the money there, so right away I knew something was wrong. I crashed there many times before and knew how to jimmy open a first-floor window. After getting it open and climbing inside, I felt my stomach drop. That old cliche about the smell of blood, how it hangs heavy in the air where a lot has been spilled. is as true as steel, especially on a warm Texas evening. The smell in TJ's house was so strong, I felt a shiver run up my spine, realizing something really, really bad had happened. I ran through the house, yelling his name, asking where he was. I found him upstairs in the bathtub, curled up. He wasn't just dead. It looked like someone had tried to take him apart. I didn't look long. I couldn't. But from what little I saw, his fingers were missing. Part of his face was gone. Someone had carved a large patch of skin from his side, so much that I could see ribs peeking through. That's the snapshot I can never get out of my head, even though I must have looked for no more than a second. I didn't stay. I slipped out the way I came, ran to my truck, and drove straight to Jody's to tell him what I'd found. Someone had come looking for us. We agreed the best thing was to hide somewhere. Jody said he could find us a place in Oklahoma, somewhere real quiet and out of the way, but we needed to square things away at home first, get the money, warn people who needed warning. Then we could meet at a motel just outside town and drive to Oklahoma from there. It sounded smart enough. A base of operations outside town for a few hours, then be gone by evening. After driving all over town, making sure my girl got to her mom's safely, I arrived at the motel to feel my stomach drop a second time. Police were outside the room Jody said he'd be in, with police tape across the open door. EMTs were there too. I didn't see them walking around, but their ambulance was present. All I needed to see to know they'd gotten Jody too. I left town immediately, tail between my legs, but with the money in my trunk. I plan on going back. I still have family in Texas. But once I reached Oklahoma and found a motel, I saw a news report about Jody. It wasn't just hearing about his murder that terrified me. It was the witness description that became the basis for the police's person of interest appeal. When a newscaster read the description, a tall, stocky man with long hair and a wild-looking beard, it sounded almost exactly like Vincent. Someone matching that description had been seen in the motel parking lot acting strangely. Around the time of the murders, the same person allegedly jumped in a truck and sped away from the scene. Vincent wasn't the only guy in Texas with a long beard and ponytail, so that could have been coincidence. But what were the chances of the same person wearing an oversized hat and having bandages around his head? I'd never been so frightened in my entire life. I'd never been in a situation where I actually considered pinching myself, half convinced I'd wake up and discover the whole thing was just a horrible nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. And I faced the very real possibility that Vincent had somehow survived TJ's attempt to kill him and had come for revenge. Looking back, it was probably more likely the cartel had somehow tracked us down. But just the thought of some half-dead Vincent walking around looking like he'd crawled out of a grave, it sends shivers up my spine even all these years later. I live somewhere else now, just about as far from Texas as possible without having to learn another language. Let's just say whatever people speak here sure as hell isn't Spanish.